So I talked about how weapons of mass destruction really change the calculus between force and policy. And in a lot of ways, terrorism does the same thing. And I call this segment the calculus of terrorism because I want to stress that while in some respects terrorism seems crazy and irrational, in other respects we can think of it as being highly rational. And let me show you what I mean. So what do you do if you can't compete in conventional force? Right? You just know, for example, that you're Iran. You can't defeat the United States in a conventional war. Well, one solution is get nuclear weapons. But there's a lot of actors around the world that can't get nuclear weapons. Either they don't have the technological capability, or they can't get the materials, or it's just too expensive. So a different way of solving the same problem, instead of kind of going up the technological ladder to weapons of mass destruction, is to go down the technological ladder to terrorism. And terrorism, in that sense, is a classic weapon of the weak. And in many respects, actors use terrorism because they're weak. So we can think of terrorism either as coercion or as deterrence, right? It's raising the costs of a policy that you're trying to stop. And in many cases, terrorism is used as a way of raising the cost of foreign occupation, right? We want you to get out of our country, so we're going to start blowing stuff up. In other cases, it's used within a country to actually force a change in policy. So how is terrorism different than conventional warfare? A key aspect of terrorism is to avoid direct battle, right? Usually a terrorist group is a very small number of people. They can't actually fight a battle and win with the forces that they're fighting against. So your goal is to be secretive and never to actually engage in direct combat. Instead, you attack these so-called soft targets, right? Civilians, you blow up civilians in marketplaces, you murder politicians, you go after unguarded, there's a typo there, I'm sorry, or weak military targets to kill soldiers. And what you don't do is provide any targets for retaliation, right? You hide, you sneak around, you don't let them ever know who you are in the first place. And this is why we often call terrorism asymmetric conflict, because pretty much everything we've been talking about up until now in terms of international conflict is between state and state, right? Or in some cases, maybe between a state army and a rebel army. But this is between a state and some other kind of non-state organization, typically. And that is really important because states, or even a rebel group that controls a territory, they have a territory, they have a population, and those things allow there to be targets for coercion and deterrence. Terrorism works best for groups that don't actually control a territory or a population, because once you have a territory or a population, there's a place, right, that we can go find you and hit you. And so Islamic State, or ISIS as it was called, was a great example of this, which it grew out of sort of anti-American terrorist movements in Iraq. And as long as they were operating as a terrorist movement or as an insurgent movement, we never knew where to find them. They had nothing that we could hit, and so on. Once they declared themselves to be Islamic State and took over territory and tried to defend that territory, right, now we could attack the territory, and they were forced to defend it. So once you're defending territory, you can be forced to give battle, which is something that you don't want to do because, you can't win that face-to-face battle. Okay, so, and that gets this question, right? How do you deter an actor that has no territory and no population, right? If terrorists say we're going to go attack civilians as a way of putting pressure on the government, you don't really know which civilians, quote-unquote, belong to the terrorists. The terrorists have not made a commitment to protecting some territory or population. All they're trying to do is raise your costs. And so that fact, the fact that terrorism does not have assets that allow it easily to be deterred, right, doesn't have things that we can destroy in order to raise their costs, is one of the things that makes it so difficult to deal with terrorism. And the impact of that is it actually switches us, right, back from deterrence. We can't really deter them, and so it switches us back to defense, to this question of then how you actually stop them from doing what they're trying to do in the first place. And one of the real interesting questions there that a lot of countries have grappled with, including the United States, is when you think about defending yourself against terrorists, do you think of it as defense in a military sense? Or do you think of it as defense in a law enforcement sort of sense? And what are the relative strengths and weaknesses of bringing those different models of crime prevention / aggression prevention to the table?